we have this fine gentleman who is going to spend the next 10 minutes or so helping us to understand that hate is rising and what can we do collectively to ensure that love remains supreme. I welcome you, Farid Khan.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I am honored that the Congress invited me. I've spoken with Alex a number of times, met him in Toronto a few months back for the first time, and it was like we bonded instantaneously. I am the founder of a group called Canadians United Against Hate. We were founded a number of years ago to basically address the rise of hate in this country. And we've seen hate targeting all different racialized minority groups, as well as members of the LGBTQ2 community. So that is the main focus of our organization. I'm not going to go into my bio, it's relatively long, but I have done quite a bit of media around issues of hate and racism and human rights. And when Alex learned of this, he asked if I would be interested in speaking at this conference. So thank you once again, Alex, for inviting me to be part of this. I'd like to begin my remarks by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people in Canada's National Capital Region. And I'd like to once again thank the Canadian Congress on Inclusivity, Diversity, and Workplace Equity for organizing this conference and inviting me to participate. The repercussions of colonialism continue to be felt today to the detriment of racialized communities, and they continue to shape society in harmful ways. So this theme of this conference is relevant to the struggle, not only against colonialism, but also to fight racism. Now, racism in the media is one subject about which there's been considerable academic research, and this research confirms that it's a reality. And that topic alone merits its own 1 or 2 day conference, given the impact that racism in the media has on societies. But I'll only be scratching the surface of this issue in the short time I have, and I'll be focusing primarily on how biased or racist media has impacted Muslims. Media has immense power to shape societies. It's been the case historically, and it's even more so during the broadcast and digital media era. And given the theme of this conference, I'd like to begin by pointing out that colonial systems, whether in Canada or elsewhere, are inextricably linked to genocide, slavery, and white supremacy. Settler colonial societies like Canada are founded on these ugly realities, whether or not Canadians want to admit it. And it's because this nation is rooted in that history that racism is endemic and systemic. It's why the human rights of racialized people have been violated repeatedly in this country since before Confederation and into the 21st century. This also means that the public and private institutions that built Canada were in turn founded on policies rooted in Indigenous genocide, slavery, and white supremacy, and the racism that accompanied them. Now, while society has evolved and continues to evolve, and we're trying to mitigate how society is was impacted by this history, we can't get away from the fact that this is a reality on the ground for a lot of people. And as a result, racism is part of the DNA of all major institutions in this country, whether they care to admit it or not. And as much as politics and capitalism has shaped this nation, so has media. At times, hand in glove with governments and politicians, and media has been obviously complicit in colonialism. Many experts who study media will say without hesitation that racism has been and continues to be a part of the media ecology, particularly within right-wing media. All you have to do is look at the mainstream news and entertainment media to realize this. Examples abound of instances where media has enabled hate and racism. Fox News and the tabloid press in the UK are prime examples, and of course, with major media outlets led by senior executives who are primarily white men, this should not be surprising. That's not saying that those white men are all racist. It's just that they're part of a system, and unconsciously they are perpetuating racism. I'd like to begin, and if you can introduce the first slide, I'd like to begin by looking at Hollywood-based entertainment media, which has been involved in promoting racist stereotypes since its inception. From racist portrayals of Black people, East Asians, and Indigenous Americans, you'll find an abundance of Hollywood fare that conveys racist messaging and stereotypes. One group of people that's been the target of racist Hollywood films for more than a century are Arabs, and by extension, Muslims, given that the vast majority of Arabs are Muslims. Real Bad Arabs is a 2006 documentary based on a book by American professor Jacques Shaheen, which looks at how Hollywood corrupts or manipulates the images of Arabs and Muslims. It is based on a review of more than 1,000 films featuring Arab and Muslim characters going back to the beginning of the Hollywood film industry. Its message is that Hollywood has vilified and portrayed Arabs and Muslims through a racist lens since the start of the film industry, thereby implanting racist stereotypes into the minds of the public. This view was reinforced in a 2018 report that details how Hollywood films and TV shows have demonized Muslims and the Islamic faith. This report was only one among many reports and studies that have highlighted the existence of anti-Muslim bigotry and racism in Hollywood. In recent decades, all you have to do is look at some of the films and TV shows coming out of Hollywood, including blockbuster films, where Arabs and Muslims have been dehumanized and are only seen as terrorists, violent extremist thugs, or in the case of Muslim women, people that need to be saved and civilized. Films like Executive Decision and True Lies from the 1990s and The Siege, which is also in the late 90s, Iron Man in the 2000s, wove violent Muslims into the stories as villains and didn't make any differentiation between their villains and the vast majority of Muslims who are peaceful. And then you have long-running TV series like Homeland and 24, which made a point of making Muslims recurring villains. These are only a handful of the Hollywood products where Muslims and Arabs are consistently cast as the enemy, bent on destroying democracy and the West and spreading their uncivilized culture on the rest of us. Now think about what this does to a public fed on this imagery year after year, how they respond when they encounter Muslims in their lives, and think about the impact that negative stereotypes of Muslims promoted in the guise of entertainment has on society at large. However, despite the history of Hollywood vilifying and denigrating Muslims and their faith, it's news media that by far has done the greatest damage in feeding the beast of Islamophobia. Since long before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Western news media portrayed the Muslim world, and by extension Muslims, in a negative light. We first started seeing this in the modern era during and after the Arab-Israeli War in 1967. It escalated during the OPEC oil shock of the early and mid-1970s, continued during the Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis, and we continued seeing Islamophobic news headlines and stories throughout the 80s and in the 90s in the lead up to and following the Gulf War. Then 9/11 happened and the floodgates of anti-Muslim media portrayals opened wide. And while there was a lot of research that received media coverage highlighting the role that news media played in fanning anti-Muslim hate, it was generally ignored by producers, editors, and news executives because there were ratings and profits in telling stories with anti-Muslim slants. This is a story from the American Pundit magazine, which was published in the weeks following the 9/11 attacks. It talked about the hypocrisy of mainstream media outlets which condemned anti-Muslim hate crimes that surged in the wake of 9/11, while at the same time their Islamophobic media coverage of the attack spread fear through Western Muslim communities and in effect terrorized them. The terminology used in media stories took the actions of a handful of extremists who were Muslim and blamed all 1.6 billion followers of the Islamic faith for the crimes they committed. Pejorative terms like Islamic terrorism, Muslim terrorist, and jihadist were interchangeably used in headlines and news stories, and in the process stigmatized Muslims living in the West. This prejudicial and racist media coverage continued in stories about the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, the war on terror, and any story related to violent attacks involving Muslims. This xenophobic coverage fed the anti-Muslim hate that has become in many ways normalized in Canada and other Western countries. And then when you get headlines or discussions on major news shows with headlines like this from CNN, along with anti-Muslim rants in the echo chamber of right-wing talk radio, it's no wonder that a majority of the public has negative attitudes towards Muslims and why Muslims feel threatened in their communities. These negative media portrayals are likely part of the reason why nearly half of Canadians said they had a negative view of Muslims in an Angus Reid poll conducted in 2017, only months after the Quebec City mosque shooting. Another example of headlines is from the British press. If you read each of them, the message that's conveyed is that anything related to Muslims is something to be feared, reviled, and hated. Such headlines and stories are reminiscent of stories and editorial cartoons about Jews in German newspapers and magazines in the 1920s and 30s. The dehumanization that occurs when the public repeatedly sees such headlines and stories about a minority community is one of the factors that contributes to public perceptions that the community is an enemy. Here are two magazine covers which are also negative and racist in their portrayal of Muslims. On the left is one from Charlie Hebdo, a notoriously Islamophobic French publication, where the cartoon implies that the Prophet of Islam was a pedophile, while on the right is one with Barack Obama in traditional Muslim attire on the covers of all publications of the New Yorker magazine. The implication being that Obama was a secret Muslim and therefore was unfit to be president. Media bias is also evident in the way that attacks by Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists are covered compared to the way that attacks against Muslims are covered. Here are the front pages of the Globe and Mail comparing the day after two terrorist attacks. The Boston Marathon bombing was an event in the US where 2 people died, and the Quebec City mosque shooting happened on Canadian soil where 6 people were murdered. Notice how the attack on Canadian soil gets only a column of coverage compared to the full page and banner headline for the attack in Boston. Here's another example of the bias of Globe and Mail editors in their coverage of a story where Muslims were the victims. On March 15, 2019, a white supremacist gunman walked into 2 mosques in New Zealand, spraying the worshippers with gunfire. 51 people were killed and another 50 were seriously injured. The day after the shooting, this was the cover of the Globe and Mail, which mentioned nothing about this horrific attack. And here are 2 more newspaper covers. Compare the headline on the left, where the perpetrator of the Orlando nightclub shooting is referred to as a maniac, to the headline on the right about the New Zealand mosque shooter, where he's referred to as an angelic boy. The prejudice and racist mindset of the editors is evident in how they framed these stories. The reality is that Muslims have been under assault by media for decades, and another example of this is that Muslims who are merely accused of plotting violence but don't act on it receive 700% more negative media coverage than white supremacists and right-wing extremists who actually commit acts of violence resulting in death. The institutional media bias is clear, and it's fed at times by political narratives pushed by right-wing politicians that paints Muslims as enemies. We saw this in the US when Donald Trump was president. And this is also the case with the Quebec government and its Bill 21 secularism law, which, while it affects all racialized religious minorities, was meant to specifically target Muslims. In doing this, Quebec is taking a page from France, a nation which has adopted some of the strongest anti-Muslim policies of any Western democracy, rooted in fascism and the worst kind of racism. Islamophobia in Canada was also fed by the policies of the Stephen Harper government and enabled by his right-wing media allies in the post-media chain at the time. Now, while I've focused most of my comments on media portrayals of Muslims, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Black and Indigenous communities also face the same problems in how new media portrays their stories. If you think about stories around the Black Lives Matter movement, the way that media has covered police shootings of Black people, or the way that media in Canada has covered disruptive protests by Indigenous people, you'll see the same negative approach in covering these stories that are taken to covering Muslim-related stories. Here's an example of the number of critical news stories in 2020 about Wet'suwet'en land defenders in BC who are blocking roads, and compared to the number of critical stories about violent mobs, violent mobs of white men attacking Mi'kmaq fishers and their boats in Nova Scotia. And amazingly, here's a cartoon that was published in a major newspaper in Missouri only days after George Floyd's murder by a white police officer. It's clearly racist in its imagery and messaging targeting Black people, implying that Black people are criminals and that white people are going to be attacked by Blacks because there's been a success in defunding police. The public reaction to this was intensely negative, and it resulted in the editor and the publisher of the newspaper resigning, and the interim editor publishing an unreserved apology and retraction. This demonstrated that an activist public response to racist news material can make a difference to help change happen. So what's the solution? What can ordinary citizens do to change negative media narratives on issues related to racialized communities? The first thing is to diversify newsrooms and make sure that the people who we see telling the stories on TV, on radio, and newspapers reflect the diversity of Canada. The second is to diversify the senior management of newspapers and newsrooms so that those who make the decisions about the stories told, the editors and executive producers, are people who have lived experiences in diverse communities and can push past the ingrained white privilege and white blindness that exists in far too many news organizations. The third is to call out racist or xenophobic news material, as in the case of the cartoon, where and when they happen. Letting such stories stand without objection ends up inflaming racist attitudes and endangers racialized communities. There are many other solutions as well, but there are far too many to discuss in this short time. The major structural changes at the executive level of newspapers and TV and radio companies is not going to happen overnight. It requires sustained activism and pressure to make that happen. The colonial mindset rooted in white privilege has been around for more than a century, and despite best efforts over the last few decades, change has been slow to happen. But we can't give up. We have to continue the work to decolonize media institutions so that their products reflect Canada's diversity, as do the people who work there. In closing, I'd like to note that given the role that media plays in shaping public opinion in society at large, this is a subject that deserves a conference of its own, or at least a 90-minute seminar. So I hope that the Congress organizers will take that under advisement and we'll see something along those lines in the future. And I'd be happy to participate at that time if you would like me to. And finally, I'd like to end with the following. Being non-racist and passive in our approach to racism in society is not enough to undo the legacies of racism, white supremacy, slavery, Indigenous genocide, and colonialism that are part of the societal and cultural DNA of this country. For meaningful change to take place, to undo all the damage done by these legacies, we must commit ourselves to being actively and uncompromisingly anti-racist in our words and our deeds for change to happen. Thank you very much.
Wow, wow, wow. Quite amazing, quite amazing. Thank you for such an enlightening conversation. We've heard it, right? And I appreciate you also bringing into the fact that, you know, when what the Muslim are experiencing based on the bias, the remarkable, troubling bias of the media towards Muslims, the Blacks also are receiving that, the Indigenous are receiving that. So this is not about coming and choosing one area and say it is. I think this is, I mean, the other speaker that also spoke was quick to also say, what we are saying here is not got to do with one particular race. This is a systemic issue. There's a comment here that I think really captures what you've said. It says when yes, dehumanizing Muslim for the same violence is very obvious. When whites kill, they say it's mental health. When Muslim kill, they say it's a terrorist, right? So
very true, very true. I mean, if you see the headlines and you see the stories, when a white shooter commits an act of terrorist violence, it's not ascribed to everybody who's white. No, it's just an individual. Yeah. Whereas exactly. when it's a Muslim or when it's a Black person or a racialized person, then the entire community is tarred with that brush.
Exactly. So I remember one time a plane flew into the mountains. I don't know if you all remember that in Europe, right? It just took everybody inside. And they first of all thought it was a mistake. Maybe a pilot made a mistake. And then later found out that the pilot actually intentionally flew the plane with people inside into a mountain, killing all of them. I almost dropped when I saw the headline, mental health. Now, of course, we understand mental health and all that. But that man was a terrorist. That is the truth. He flew that plane into that stuff, and you know, people died. So for me personally, I used to love Law and Order, for those who know Law and Order. But at one point I looked at, it's always the Black guy raping a white girl. It's always the Black guy snatching the wallet. It's always the Black guy. I'm like, dude, man, I don't rape, I don't snatch wallets. You are not being equitable in the distribution of your content.